I'm here today to share a method to make easy serger rolled hem napkins that I learned from a gal named Rooby, who in the early days of the internet, before Facebook, when one belonged to message lists, Rooby ran an online shop called Web of Thread, and she shared this method in one of her newsletters. It's a great way of making easy rolled hem napkins. I used it to make the napkins for the Vermont Modern Quilt Guild Think 6 challenge. I've used it many times to make rolled hem napkins. It makes about a 20-inch napkin, so a nice good size. And you can also use this method to make rolled hem hankies if there are people in your family who enjoy using bandana-sized cotton hankies. You're going to need some fabric upon which to make the serger rolled hems. Quilting cotton is great. You might have some in your stash that you can use. Whether you're going to the fabric store and shopping or whether you're shopping your stash, for this method you figure 10 inches of fabric per napkin. So we're making 20-inch napkins, so technically it means you're making 2 napkins in 20 inches of fabric, but it's easier to remember. 10 inches per napkin. So if you're going to make 4 napkins, that's 40 inches. 40 inches is just shy of 1.1 yards, but that's going to assume that your ends are cut nice and square and you don't need any extra for testing or maybe making an oops. So better to figure 1.25 yards for 4. And for the rest of the math, I'll let you figure it out. This method uses quilting cotton. If you want to make your napkin out of something heavier like Essex linen, you're going to need to test and maybe try doing the rolled hem with the wide setting on your serger. I make no guarantees, lots of testing, but this will work on quilting cotton, Kona cotton, that kind of fabric. Next, get out your serger and your serger manual so you know how to set it up to do a rolled hem. The first thing you want to do is retract the stitch finger. On my machine, it's a lever that I pull back away from the needles, which retracts the stitch finger. On some machines, you need to put a different throat plate on that doesn't have the stitch finger. A stitch finger is akin to the bit of metal on your overcast foot for your sewing machine, that when you're doing an overcast seam, the needle hits to the right of that bit of metal so that the thread tension doesn't scrunch up your seam allowance. Same thing with the stitch finger. The loopers form the stitch around the stitch finger. Usually you want the seam allowance to lie flat. There are a few other things that you might need to set on your serger to get that to happen, but definitely the stitch finger needs to be engaged. For the rolled hem, you want the fabric to curl and roll. That makes the rolled hem, so you retract the stitch finger. The next thing you want to do is change your stitch length to quite short, akin to a satin stitch on your sewing machine. And the next thing you need is some thread. I like using Metler 40/30 weight quilting thread in the loopers. The instructions for rolled hem often say to use a thinner weight thread, a 50 weight or a 60 weight, which is like lingerie thread. But I think they're assuming that you are doing a rolled hem on a lightweight fabric garment like chiffon or voile, and we're doing rolled hem on quilting cotton. And I want my rolled hem to look more like the hem or the purl, P-U-R-L, than a Mero machine, which is the commercial industrial machine that puts on napkins that you buy with a rolled hem looking edge. So I like Metler 40/30 weight quilting cotton. Typically I have to mail order it because shops don't carry everything these days. Aurifil also makes a 40 weight and a 30 weight thread. I have some Orifil 30 weight, which technically should be thicker than a 40 weight, but it's thinner than Mettler's 40 weight quilting cotton. So I'm a Mettler gal. I like Mettler. You can also use other machine or hand quilting thread that's a little thicker. So I have some YLI machine quilting thread, which is thick and also makes a nice rolled hem. You want to use a coordinating regular weight 50 weight cotton or regular poly thread in your needle. You can also use textured nylon or textured poly. I have some poly yarn, which is by Superior Threads. It is not a twisted thread. It kind of spreads out and makes good coverage on a rolled hem. It's also very soft and it's stretchy, so it's used to serge seams for swimsuits or dance costumes, things that you want stretchy. It's also used for seams that you want to be very soft, like baby clothes. I've used it to serge, not roll hem, serge the edge of a whack of polar fleece to make blankets. If you want to use this type of thread, be very careful using textured nylon because nylon has a lower melting point than poly. So if you throw your fabric napkins in the washing machine and then in the dryer and they come out wrinkled and you want to iron them, nylon may melt from the heat of your iron. So textured poly is a better bet if you like that look. Next, follow the threading instructions for your particular serger for setting it up to do a 3-thread rolled hem. If you have a 3/4 thread serger, you need to remove one of the needles. There are some serging techniques when you're only using 3 threads that you can leave the second needle in just unthreaded. For this, really you need to remove the needle that you're not using. So my serger says the rolled hem is made using the narrow setting, so I'm removing the left hand needle and leaving the right hand needle in. Now that the serger is all threaded, one needle's been removed, the stitch finger's retracted, the stitch length is shortened, you need to refer to your serger manual for what settings to use to make a rolled hem, because we are going to be changing the thread tensions. If you have an older machine that doesn't have numbers on the dials for the thread tensions, you might want to put a little piece of tape on the front plate of your machine and a little piece of tape on the knob and draw a little line showing where your settings are. If you have your serger all set up for something that you always do with the thread you always use and the setting is perfect, you might want to write that down before you fiddle with the thread tensions. The upper looper thread wraps around and is what you see for the rolled hem. So on my machine, the rolled hem is forming on the top face of the fabric. So when I do my rolled hem, I want the printed side facing up. If your machine is set up differently so that the upper looper is tightened and the lower looper is loose, then your rolled hem is going to be forming on the lower side and you're going to want to make your rolled hem with the wrong side facing up. I run the machine a little bit without the fabric in just to make sure that the chain is forming. If the chain doesn't form, you know you haven't got it threaded correctly and you need to go back and rethread. So I am going to test my setup. Just as for any sewing technique, when you're doing something new or with settings that are different, you need to test it to make sure the results are what you want. And that looks good. The first step of actually making the rolled hems is to roll hem all along the length of one side of your fabric, cutting off the selvage. When you get to the end, You want to leave several inches of tail. Don't trim it close to the fabric. Next, you're going to turn the fabric 180 and start serging at the other cut edge, cutting off the other selvage. Now you've got the width of your fabric with the selvages cut off and with rolled hems down each side. You're going to do the same thing, roll hemming the length down the center. If you can work from a fold in your fabric, you can press the fabric, or maybe there's a nice crease pressed in. With this dark fabric, I won't be able to see the fold. I am going to use chalk to mark a line just outside of 20 inches. You can use pen, pencil, chalk, anything. It doesn't really matter because you're going to cut the line off. It's just so you can roll hem in a straight line down the length of your fabric. So I've marked a chalk line, because this is dark fabric, down the length of my fabric. I just picked 20 1/8 away from my rolled hem. I am going to run this chalk line down the knife. I'm going to cut along this line. Now you've got a napkin width of fabric with rolled hem down each side, and you've got the other half of the length of fabric with rolled hem down one side. We need to do a rolled hem down this side. If you have a landmark on the front of your serger for where to run the cut edge to get the same width of finished napkin width with rolled hems on two sides, you can use that. Otherwise, you might need to mark another lengthwise line for a roll hem guide. Now you've got the second napkin width length of fabric with rolled hem down the length of each side. And now you're going to start doing the crosswise rolled hems. You're going to start with the top edge. If it's really uneven, you might want to square it up before you start. You do want to cut even a sliver of fabric off. The roll hem is going to work best. You're going to ensure that you have the full width of the seam allowance rolling if the knife is cutting off a sliver of fabric. The trickiest bit of this whole technique is when you're starting the crosswise bits of roll hem and you're going across the already rolled hem part. The knife cuts through the rolled hem and then it feeds up to the needle, and if you're not careful, you can get a little pleat happening. So you might need to test this a few times, which is why it's good to have a little extra fabric. You might need to reduce the pressure on your presser foot a little bit. You might need to set your differential feed a little bit to the negative, which stretches out, not gathers, but stretches out, whatever the setting for that is on your serger. And then the final technique is that you need to go slowly. You might want to lift the foot and have the rolled hem right next to the knife. Cut the fabric, and then as it approaches the needle, you might need to again lift the foot, adjust the fabric, make sure that the fabric is over to the right next to the needle. And then when you get to the end, just hold your hand next to what you're roll hemming. Keep roll hemming in a straight line. Roll hem right off the edge. The knife is going to cut this bit of chain, but again, you want to leave several inches. before you trim. So now you've got your napkin with a length of fabric with rolled hems down each side. You've got a rolled hem along the top edge. Next, we need to make the roll hem that cuts this piece off into a napkin size and finishes this napkin. The easiest way to mark where to cut and roll hem to make your napkin is to fold one corner down as if you were finding bias and mark where that comes to. That is going to make a square. Now you want to have the piece with 3 sides of roll hem to the left. Cut just alongside the mark you just made. That will cut this fabric and put the 4th side of rolled hem, making your first finished napkin. Then turn the length of fabric still to be rolled hem and put a rolled hem across the top. You don't have to cut the chain every time, just leave enough that there's a couple of inches between each napkin. The next to last step is to use seam sealant on all the corners before you trim your strings. I like to use June Taylor's Fray Block. It dries clear and soft. You might have to mail order this one. Dritz Freight Check is readily available at places like Joann. It dries clear, but it dries stiff, which can be pokey, which might not matter for napkins, but isn't great for other applications. So you want to find a place where you can spread out your napkins. The easiest way to use the least amount of space for the most amount of napkins is to fan them out. You want to protect your surface. You can use tissues or paper towel. Under the corners, you can put down an old towel if you have such that you keep for this kind of tasks. I've got a couple of pieces of freezer paper, plastic on the back, paper on the front, that I lay out plastic side down. So just something to protect your surface from the seam sealant, because you're going to get dots of it underneath on the corner. Then follow the instructions for your seam sealant. My seam sealant says to run it under hot water for 3 minutes and then shake for 30 seconds. And then you want to be careful. Probably want to test how fast it comes out somewhere that's not on your napkins. You want to put a drop of seam sealant or a few drops of seam sealant so that both edges are sealed, both the long bit that you're going to cut off and also the short bit that the knife already cut. After you've put seam sealant on all your corners, now you have to go away and let it dry. I love Rooby's instructions. The gal who made the instructions that I follow, her instructions say, now leave it alone and go to bed. No, really, go to bed. Because in her head, the scenario she's envisioned is that you'd bought quilting cotton that's thematic to whatever holiday is happening tomorrow. and that you've been doing other projects running up to the holiday, and you've spent the day probably cleaning your house and cooking for the holiday tomorrow, and that you haven't started on your Serger rolled hem napkins until after dinner or later than that. So you need to leave the seam sealant to get really dry before you trim the serger strings off. And when it's dry and you go to trim it, I suggest that you don't use your good fabric snips, but that you use a heftier scissor, because you are going to be cutting through the sealant, which is going to have made your thread stiff. So I use my Ginger Taylor snips. And there you have it. Easy Serger rolled hem napkins.